ACC 15, obviously beautiful San Diego, California. You know, the first appropriate use criteria for cardiac imaging originated 2005 was the very first published. Then there were several after that, but the first one came in 2005, and now here we are 10 years later. And so in the March 3rd issue of JACC, a look at the first decade of appropriate use criteria: is the glass half empty or half full? To help answer that question, this editorial comment was co-authored by my guest here, Todd D. Miller, who is an MD, professor of medicine at Mayo Clinic. And you're talking about a paper by Marwick and colleagues. It's a systematic review of the various temporal changes in appropriateness of cardiac imaging. In your paper, you talked about why it was necessary to evaluate this at this point. Give me an idea of where we are in terms of 10 years later and why we really do need to take a look at this in a study.
Well, if you look at the Marwick paper, I think it accomplished two major goals. The first goal was it was just a comprehensive, rigorous meta-analysis of all the published literature. So just on that basis alone, it serves a useful purpose. And its second goal was to help determine, was there a change in categories of appropriate studies categorized as appropriate over time? All of the initial imaging modalities had a document published for transthoracic echo, transesophageal, nuclear, CTA, and those 5 imaging modalities. And then all of them had a revised document published. And they were trying to determine, was the categorization process made more efficient by applying the latter revised document, and also was there a change in physician behavior once these documents were rolled out into practice, were physicians reading these and then ordering more appropriate studies. And they found that there were, first of all, fairly high rates of appropriate studies for both transthoracic and transesophageal echo at baseline. 80 or 90% of the studies were appropriate. But even within those modalities, there were slight but significant increases in studies rated appropriate by applying the second version of the document. There was a major jump in CTA, which only started about in the mid 30% range for appropriate and jumped up to about 55% with the second document. But interestingly, for the two stress modalities, either stress echo or stress nuclear, there wasn't much change. Stress echo started out in the low 50% range and was about the same with the second document application. And stress nuclear started out around 70% and again was unchanged with the second document.
Why the variation?
Well, no one has a good answer to that, but part of it is probably because it's easier to categorize studies. The way the document's written is probably, if you're ordering a transesophageal echo, you're more likely to be ordering an appropriate study. It's a bit of an invasive procedure, it involves more,
right.
Whereas the screening of stress tests in the general low-risk population has a lot of heterogeneity with it.
I mean, there were obviously some good reasons why there is a need for appropriate use criteria. And it's commonly assumed that educational efforts will lead to more appropriate imaging, but you point out that studies examining the impact of educational initiatives on the ordering of such tests actually have kind of conflicting results.
Yes, that's very interesting. So we did one of those studies in our own institution at Mayo, and the group out at Harvard has done them as well. But in our study, we looked at the baseline appropriate rate, and then we looked at it just 1 year later before we even put our educational initiative into practice, and the number of inappropriate studies fell by half. They went from 14% down to 7%. And then after we applied this extensive educational effort, which included grand rounds presentations, going to the different medical practice groups, telling them what we were trying to accomplish, et cetera, it went from 7% inappropriate back up to 11%. So at least our educational effort accomplished nothing. The Harvard group was able to show that primarily with cardiology fellows ordering studies, they were able to make some inroads, but nobody really knows if that's going to be a lasting effect because their study ended at the end of their interventional effort. So is it going to persist once they stop it? Who knows?
So at this point, is the glass half empty or is it half full in your mind?
Well, I think the other point that the authors didn't emphasize in the meta-analysis, Marwick and colleagues, didn't emphasize this much. It's a little bit in the paper, but my colleague Wells Askew, who I wrote this editorial with, what we tried to bring out was they didn't really look at too much the inappropriate studies, and inappropriate studies were actually going up for the two modalities of stress echo and stress nuclear. They went up by about 10 percentage points. So you have a little bit of drop in You have a little bit of an improvement in appropriate studies. You have some increase, though, in inappropriate studies. I think all of that indicates that maybe we're able to categorize studies more effectively, okay? But it really doesn't seem to be changing physician behavior too much so far. But with the caveat that most of these publications are arising from tertiary care academic medical centers, and does any of this really extrapolate to what's going on in the bigger general practice of cardiology in the country? We have no idea. I think the situation will improve when we have much more uniform application of electronic medical records, because it makes it easier to collect all the data that you need to do this correctly. Right. And then having some type of computer application where you can rate these studies at the point of ordering. And if you're ordering an inappropriate study, some flag will come up on the computer and say, hey, you can't do this. Right. So I think once we have a efficient computer tool at the point of ordering, this whole process will improve.
Well, this is in the March 3rd issue of JACC. It's a pair of papers, first one by Marwick and then Dr. Miller's editorial commentary. Please check out the papers in JACC. For Cardiol Source World News, I am Executive Editor Rick McGuire.